Good night, everyone, and welcome to the Energy Systems Engineering Unit's webinar, hosted by the University of Trinidad and Tobago. My name is Evangeline Pardesi, and I will be co-moderating, along with Mr. Neil Allen, the Discipline Coordinator for the Energy Systems Engineering Unit, for tonight's discussion. So the topic of discussion is there a future for the hydrocarbon sector in Trinidad and Tobago? Our panelists are Ms. Jasmine Medina, Dr. Donny Budal, Dr. Edward Baahu, Mr. Conrad Len, and Mr. Brian Cabrera. To all our viewers on, please note that at the end of this discussion, we'll be moving with the Q&A segment. So comment your questions on the YouTube link, or you can send your questions via WhatsApp to 319-9244. So let's get right into it. To kick off this webinar, we begin with Ms. Jasmine Medina. Jasmine Shivani Medina holds a Bachelor's of Science in Mechanical Engineering with honors and a Master of Science in Petroleum Engineering from the University of the West Indies and is currently pursuing a PhD in Petroleum Engineering. Jasmine has 11 years of work experience, with 5 being in the oil and gas industry and 6 in academia. She has 5 years of experience working with Schlumberger as a field engineer and has worked in various locations internationally. Medina's experience also extends to her work with various research institutions globally on alternative energy solutions, drilling optimization, and the area of brain-computer interfaces. Her 6 years in academia focused on lecturing an array of courses in various engineering programs and research in the areas of produced water, foamy oil production, and grid integration. So, Ms. Medina, the floor is all yours.
Hi, thank you very much for that introduction, Evangeline. So good night, everyone. For tonight's presentation, the flow would be firstly looking at global trends, then Trinidad and Tobago's status, followed by recommendations. So globally, what is happening? What are the projected trends? What will be the energy sources that will be using for fuel? Well, BP produces a report called the Energy Outlook Yearly, and based on the 2019 report, they projected energy consumption by fuel until 2040. If we look at this diagram on the left, we'll see that they projected the primary fuel sources that will be used for consumption are oil, gas, coal, nuclear, hydro, and renewables. Now, if we look from 2020 to 2040, we can see an increase in consumption of fuel for oil, an increase in gas, decrease in coal, approximately the same for nuclear and hydro, and an increase in renewables. Now, if we look at this diagram on the right, we'll see the shares of primary energy. This is basically the percentage in the total fuel mix. So we can see at 2020, oil is at around 33%, and by 2040 is expected to drop to around 28%. Gas is currently at around 22% and is expected by 2040 to reach around 28%, the same level with oil. And renewables currently at 5% is expected to reach to 15% by 2040. Now notice although there's a decrease in the share in oil, if you look at the diagram on the left, it's actually an increase. Why is that? Because the global energy required will increase. So although the share allocated to oil is decreasing, the quantity is actually increasing. Now, based on the same report, BP projected that although they would have an increase in overall energy and primary energy is going to be increasing, there'll be a decrease in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So we can see they project using a baseline from 2018, they expect around 48% less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by 2038. Now, based on the graph prior, we can see that renewables is expected to increase and a decrease in carbon. So in terms of diversification and opportunity, we can potentially look at renewable energy and low carbon or carbon capture technologies. Now let's look at the scenario in terms of Trinidad and Tobago and a gas perspective. So based on a Ministry of Energy Natural Gas Audit Summary Report 2019, our proven and probable reserves comes in at approximately 17 TCF of gas. Globally, we rank 36 in terms of gas reserves. With our current production rate, if we sustain that production rate, we expect around 13.5 years of remaining gas. Now, how much gas do we produce per day currently, and who are these producers? So locally, we produce approximately 3.4 BCF per day of gas. This data was extracted from the Ministry of Energy's Monthly Consolidated Bulletin, volume 57, number 5. So we can see BP produces approximately 56% of the gas that we receive locally. Not included in this chart, but also producers are Perenco and Heritage Petroleum, but the percentage is below 1%, with Perenco supplying just around 22 million scoffs per day and Heritage around 12 million scoffs per day, both offshore and onshore. So how do we use this gas? So Trinidad and Tobago, this graph shows consumption by sector. It was first presented by the Energy Chamber Energy Efficiency Committee in 2016. The data was validated by the ministry monthly reports, and the figures remain still from 2016 to currently. So the percentages are roughly the same. So 90% of our gas is consumed downstream, 60% for LNG, and 30% in the petrochemical industry. Now we use 8% to generate power. Now this 8% might seem like a little bit, but in comparison to our daily consumption is equivalent to 30 cargoes of LNG, or the average of 5 petrochemical plants. So if we can reduce this 8% utilized for power generation and use it downstream, we can probably look at implementing renewables and for power generation and more gas going to our downstream sector. Now, why is it so important to send this gas downstream? So we'll see in a while. What about current projects? So we know we produce around 3.4 BCF per day. And upcoming, we have a lot of projects in terms of gas and oil. So Shell currently is looking at Barracuda in the East Coast, Colibri in the North. BPTT, Galeota expansion project, is expected to be completed by this year. Cassia C is expected to come on board in fourth quarter 2021. This is very important because currently BP supplies around 1.9 BCF of gas per day to us. So with Cassia C, it is expected to increase to around 2.3 BCF per day. Then they have Matapal project coming along as well as SIP. However, a good point to note is that turnaround for Juniper and Cassia is coming up. So there might be a dip in terms of the gas supply. In terms of BHP, they have the Ruby wells planned, EOG has the Osprey, and De Novo is pending a decision in terms of the Zandali field. With respect to oil, we have Touchstone on land. They have 3 expected onshore wells. And we also have Heritage relooking at the SBC, Southern Basin Consortium, that proved futile for Exxon in the 1960s. Another hot area, obviously, is the cross-border gas field, which, if developed, could produce around 270 to 400 million scoffs of gas per day by 2025. So just to take a look at oil, before I talk about the effects downstream. So in terms of oil, we have approximately 728 million barrels of reserves according to the EIA. This places us 41st in the world. Now, this is proven reserves. However, according to local researchers, Dr. Rafi Hussain, we have approximately 4 billion barrels of heavy oil both onshore and offshore combined. Now, the thing with heavy oil is the cost and then technology. But with improvement in technology, it's highly possible to recover a quantity of that 4 billion barrels. According to Dr. Krishna Prasad, we have approximately 3.5 billion barrels of stranded reserves. Now, we have more than 3 billion barrels of cumulative production over the past 100 years. However, we still have stranded reserves. We still have oil trapped that because of lack of EOR techniques or lack of technology that still remain underground. Probably with advancements in technology and implementation of EOR techniques, we can get some of that oil out. Now, the world's largest reserves belongs to Venezuela, which is approximately 3 billion barrels. So, is there a future in terms of oil and gas in Trinidad and Tobago? Well, according to the Trinidad and Tobago Master Gas Plan, for our downstream industry to capitalize on its efficiency, it needs approximately 4.3 BCF of gas per day. The current total production is around 3.4 BCF per day. Now, it is possible to have a short and medium and possibly long-term hydrocarbon sector, but it's fundamentally based on a few decisions. First one being government approach to the oil and gas producers exploration. You would want to make exploration and production as efficient and competitive with other countries. Also, the price and supply of natural gas to downstream plants. We are aware that the plants were experiencing a curtailing gas supply for the past few years. For these plants to operate efficiently and from a purely business standpoint, we should look at supplying them with the gas that they need at a competitive price. We should probably look at modeling contract negotiations using software and trying to make it competitive for these plants to stay and function. Why? It's easy to decommission plants and go to another country, and we really don't want that. We want to capitalize on that diagram that we saw where that gas global outlook is expected to reach 28% in that fuel consumption share. So we want to capitalize on that projection. We also should look at reducing the gas used for power generation. That gas could be used for things that might add more value. If it's utilized downstream, we're going to get back that revenue in terms of taxes by these products that's produced downstream. And in terms of oil, we could look at the development or implementation of EOR techniques and also work in development of technology to extract our heavy oil resources. So some recommendations that I propose, because we see projected increase in gas demand up until 2035, we could focus on gas production and cross-border, negotiate in terms of flexible gas contract and pricing for these downstream operators. We can also look at a storage for gas in case of emergencies or shortfall. We know that we have turnarounds coming up and we don't want to continue curtailing this gas to the downstream sector. So if we look at setting up a storage facility where when we do produce a little bit more, we can keep an emergency backup just in case. We should also look at investing in renewable sources of energy for our power generation, and probably also increasing our electricity prices to promote efficiency in terms of electricity. Also, probably electric vehicles and charging stations that utilize renewable energy to cut back on our demand for fuel. And of course, diversify the economy. We know by 2035, we expect to see the gas reaching around 28%. However, this is a time that we have to invest in diversification because you can't just change it after 15 years randomly. You have to put things in place from now. We need to start looking at technology for low carbon emissions. We need to start looking at ways to increase our gas production as well, investing in renewable energies, energy efficiency. So those are my recommendations if we want to have possible medium and long-term hydrocarbon sector in Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Ms. Medina. And those were some great points you brought up with regards to the global trends and the downstream, especially to the downstream sector. So thank you so much. So now we'll be moving on to Dr. Donny Budal. Dr. Donny Budal is an associate professor in process engineering. He holds a bachelor's in science in mechanical engineering, a postgraduate diploma in petroleum engineering, and an MSc in industrial innovation, entrepreneurship and management, and a PhD in process engineering. His research efforts have been primarily focused on sustainability, environmental management, cleaner production, GHG inventories, and GHG mitigation. His work on the cost-effective strategies for greenhouse gas mitigation in Trinidad and Tobago is highly rated, and he is regarded nationally as being at the forefront of the field of sustainable emission reductions. His work is well recognized locally and internationally. With many related publications, he is also a UNDP-appointed expert in GHG inventory, an expert reviewer for national communications for the UNFCCC, and a GHG inventory and mitigation consultant. I'll now hand you over to Dr. Donny Budal.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much to the moderator, both for the introduction and for the opportunity to speak this evening. Let me extend a pleasant good evening to yourself, the fellow panelists, and our live viewers. So the topic before us today at this webinar is there a future for the hydrocarbon sector in Trinidad and Tobago? And I'm very appreciative of the perspective outlined by Ms. Medina. And I would like to start by answering that question by looking at the past. You know, sometimes when you want to chart a way for the future, it's helpful to look at the past. There are many lessons that you can learn. And if we look at the past, for Trinidad and Tobago, for our total GDP, which is represented in red in this chart, followed by our contribution of that total GDP from the petroleum or the hydrocarbon sector in blue, we see certain pertinent information. The first thing we can notice is that whenever there was a growth in the hydrocarbon market price GDP, there was a mirrored growth in Trinidad and Tobago total GDP. Similarly, whenever there was a drop in our hydrocarbon market price GDP, that was mirrored also in our total GDP. And the other interesting thing we can see is that since the late 1990s in particular, up until present time, the contribution of this sector in blue, which is our hydrocarbon sector, towards our total GDP have been significant. In fact, if you do the maths, many times in that time horizon that I quoted, that sector contributed for over 40% of our total GDP. So just looking at the past alone and up until very recent times, it appears as though, and it, explicitly so, that our Trinidad and Tobago economy has been largely dependent on this hydrocarbon sector. So the question is asked, is there a future for this sector? And that in itself implies other questions. Should we change this trend? Can we change it? Why should we change it? How should we manage the change? And these are some of the embedded questions that I think has to be answered before the overall holistic question is answered. There are certain issues that you need to understand with a trend like this. For instance, this introduces what we call volatility, and Dr. Baahu will perhaps expand a lot more on that. but it introduces volatility because you have fluctuations in price and you have fluctuations in volumes. And when the price of your commodity, your oil, your natural gas, your associated commodities, when the prices or the volumes, and in some cases, and the volumes fluctuates, that can have a deep and rippling effect on your economy and therefore on society and our standard of living. So it's not really a stable position to be in, but we have been sustaining our economy in this manner for quite a while, and therefore we have been subjected to these volatilities. Ms. Medina spoke a lot about the global perspective of energy use, and I must congratulate her for that, because while we're looking at Trinidad and Tobago and the future of hydrocarbon sector, you need to understand that economies are connected, and we cannot operate in silos, and therefore we need to look at what is happening in the global scale, global front. And I will go through a little quickly here because I think this point was made by Ms. Medina, but if you look at just electricity generation alone, as depicted by this slide, just electricity generation. Now, hydrocarbons are used for many things, not only electricity generation. But if you look at electricity generation alone, coal is an hydrocarbon, oil is an hydrocarbon, and gas. If you add this up, based on recent data, 2018, and this has been consistently so for quite a while, these hydrocarbons still contribute over 60% of our global electricity generation. Yes, there have been penetration of renewables and other generation types, biomass, hydroelectric, solar, photovoltaic, wind, nuclear, but largely the hydrocarbon still dominates electricity generation globally. And this, as I said, this chart is just electricity generation, but hydrocarbon still dominates other aspects of our energy use globally, our transport sector and our downstream petrochemical sector. So that can be concluded from the chart on your right. The chart on the left tells an interesting story. This looks at the change in demand for electricity. And what we are seeing in the same 2018, and the trend has been consistent, there was an increased demand globally for electricity in the order of 1,000 terawatt hour. And though everything here in green were renewables, and though renewable energy were increasing as well in supplying the demand, the growth in renewable still could not match or sustain that additional growth in normal demand. So what we're seeing here is that Trinidad and Tobago, from the slide before, our economy has always been energy dependent, hydrocarbon dependent. And what we're seeing is globally, when we look outwards, the same story is illustrated, where these hydrocarbons are playing an important role. And though in recent times, we're seeing a more and more penetration of renewable energy, we're seeing also that it is not meeting that demand, that increase in demand for normal energy consumption. So it's either those renewables need to grow at a very accelerated rate, or we understand, and of course that can have effects on its own on economies if it grows at very accelerated rates. Or we understand that hydrocarbons play an important role not only in Trinidad and Tobago, but globally, and it will continue to do that for quite a while. Ms. Medina spoke about Trinidad and Tobago reserves, so I can probably do this slide very quickly, but she would have incorporated proven and probable reserves in her analysis. This is just proven reserves. Yes, at the present rate at which we produce oil in Trinidad and Tobago, against the backdrop of how much is proven, we still have about 20.5 years remaining. This is if no new finds, and this is based on just conventional sources. For natural gas at the present rate, you heard her talk about 3.5 BCF a lot, and the proven reserve, we have about 8.4 years. So this more or less corroborates her point that we have reserves, And this is just proven reserve. These are the low-hanging fruits, so to speak. They're probable. Then she spoke about it, heavy oil. I think Ms. Medina cited 4 billion barrels of potential heavy oil distributed offshore and on land in Trinidad and Tobago. Recent studies are suggesting closer to 5 billion. So there are reserves in Trinidad and Tobago. Sure, these reserves are, as the name implies, non-renewable and can be depleted, but they are reserved as of now. So if we were to look, at least in the short term, the answer is yes. If we were to look at the medium term, the answer is yes. And I'm defining short as between 0 to 3 years, medium as 3 to 10 years, and long term as greater than 10 years. And if we were to look at the long term, the answer to the holistic question is yes, with buts. There's certain things that we need to do. And Ms. Medina highlighted some. What do we need to do? What the perspective I would like to bring is that hydrocarbons are non-renewable. Hydrocarbons have a number of issues associated with it. For instance, non-renewable and therefore depleting. And also, when combusted, they result in greenhouse gas emissions, namely CO2. And it is understood by many researchers that this is having undesirable effect with respect to greenhouse gas trapping and climate change. And of course, there are other issues as well that other members of the panel will talk about. So then, what I think we need to do as a solution is we need to ensure that as we move forward in what I call a sustainable manner. We move forward in a sustainable manner where we encompass and consider all the dimensions of sustainability. We need the 3 pillars of sustainability as depicted in the slide, economic, environment, and social. We need to ensure that we consider with our plans going forward, with hydrocarbon in the mix, we need to ensure that we do it in a sustainable manner that benefits not only the economy, but also the environment. So we also try to mitigate against those emissions that I spoke about. And of course, benefits favorably on the society, job creations and what have you. So I have a little story that I often tell my students to reinforce this point of inculcating sustainability in your plan, albeit your long-term future. And I tell it via stories. So here I have 4 quadrants shown, story A, B, C, D. On the y-axis, I have growth. So this measures economic growth. And on the x-axis, I have mitigation, which is really a focus on the environment. So this is high growth, low growth. Everything on the right will be, your right will be high mitigation, low mitigation. This story, and if I use vehicles, for instance, to illustrate the story, this story A is a vehicle, and I'm just using vehicle as a forum, that is focused on high growth, let's say luxury, and low mitigation. So it's not a sustainable viewpoint, but it's more focused on the economy rather than the environment. And forgive me if my suggestions do not coincide with yours, but I'd like to think of that like a Hummer. If we look at vehicles as the analogy, it's very luxurious. It's focused on the luxury side of it at the expense of the environment. This story, D, I'm skipping to D for a reason, is now focused more on the environment at the expense of the economy. It also is not sustainable. That's the point I want to make. You don't want to focus on the environment as well at the expense of the economy. So if we were looking at vehicles, perhaps, I don't know if the viewing audience and my fellow panelists are familiar with donkey cart. It's focused more on mitigation, but at the expense of getting the job done, which has a ripple effect on the other pillars of sustainability, like our society. So it's also where we would not like to be. Story B is more where we would like to be, where we have high growth and high mitigation, maybe a Prius, for example. It's luxurious and it is also efficient. It is also sustainable from an environmental point of view. So that is what how I like to emphasize, how I like to outline this problem. And I wanted to make the point that growth and mitigation does not have to be mutually exclusive. I say this because many people think renewables may be the answer. And I am also one that share the point of view that renewables is ultimately the answer in many regards. But it's not a light switch. I think if we do a colossal switch from the way we operate now in Trinidad and globally, as illustrated by me and the previous speaker, with an uncontrolled manner and in a haphazard manner, just move to renewables for the sake of moving to renewables, then what we will do is we'll have an ill effect on the economy. That's called a shock. The same economic shock that price and volume fluctuations can add to the economy, those things also do add to the economy. So therefore, they need to be well managed. So my contribution is simple. I am saying, yes, we do have a future, hydrocarbon sector do have a future in Trinidad and Tobago economy. I'm saying that as we embrace this future with hydrocarbon in it, we should be very careful to do the sustainability assessment. I'm also saying that as we move towards renewables, we cannot neglect what we have already, what is being used globally as well. Our conventional energy and our low-hanging unconventional energy, like the heavy oils in particular. And they must be, that transition period must be recognized. And that transition period puts us into the long term, in my opinion. Because we are so embedded in a hydrocarbon economy presently, both nationally and globally, that transition towards that cleaner, greener economy and renewables it's a big period. It's a big period that we must recognize and embrace. So I am saying there's an and. We must do hydrocarbon and renewable. So let's look at it as an and rather than a spontaneous or switch. Because if we go to switch from hydrocarbon to renewable prematurely, we will shock our economy in a negative way. And it will transcend into ill effects for the same economy, the same society. Of course, global factors are important and must be integrated. I think that point was made. We need to be synergized. We need to synergize with what is going on globally. For instance, concepts such as carbon neutrality must be considered, even in this hydrocarbon economy that I'm saying we will have in Trinidad and Tobago. So as we move and keep embracing that hydrocarbon economy with that renewable energy penetration for that and period, carbon neutrality needs to be considered. So that will now highlight the importance of a technology known as carbon capture and storage, CCS. That's one way in which we can actually have that and period and reduce our emissions. So that's where we capture our emissions and we geologically store it or otherwise store it so that we avoid it from getting into the atmosphere and manifesting as a greenhouse gas. Blue and green hydrogen are also important that we could consider and integrate. For Trinidad in particular, those may be very important as well because our petrochemical sector is already, because we have so many ammonia and methanol plants in particular, we already have the means of that blue hydrogen generation. It's been done presently for consumption to produce methanol and ammonia, but that whole blue hydrogen generation concept and practicality is well known by Trinidad and Tobago, as it has been done in these industries. Green hydrogen is also important to be considered and integrated and will help add towards what we call that carbon neutrality. Also a very important point, energy efficiency is very important in any scenario. Energy efficiency is not only important in hydrocarbon future, it's also important for renewables as well, especially from that sustainability viewpoint. Because even if you're using a renewable source of energy, solar photovoltaic, for example, to produce your electrical energy, if you're not efficient in doing so, if you're not efficient in converting that solar energy into electrical energy, then your economics would be adversely affected. These things have maintenance costs attached to it, and these things have replacement costs attached to it. So your cost per kilowatt hour would be greatly affected. And that, from a sustainability point of view, does not serve us well. I'd like to just close by saying that I've worked with the Ministry of Energy, I've worked with the Ministry of Planning and other ministries and other stakeholders in Trinidad and Tobago. And I'm very proud. I'm very proud for the level of capacity that we have in this country. There's no shortage of expertise and capacity in embracing this economy I'm talking about, this hydrocarbon future integrated with renewable in a sustainable manner. There's no shortage of talent. There's no I've seen it, and I'm very proud that it exists. And I think we need to harness this, and we need to promote and keep moving in that direction. So thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Dr. Donny, for the whole perspective you brought, especially with the sustainability backdrop. So we'll now be moving on to Dr. Edward Baahu. Just a reminder to our panelists, let's keep it tight with the time and definitely save some points for the discussion after. I think it'll be very interesting, So Dr. Edward Baahu is an assistant professor at the University of Trinidad and Tobago. Prior to pursuing his doctorate, he has worked as an economist in various capacities in different industries. As an instructor, he has a passion for teaching economics, especially to students pursuing non-business related fields of study in various programs throughout the university. He is also a published author, having written textbooks for ordinary and advanced levels in economics, catering for Caribbean students. His completed doctoral work applied both macroeconomic and microeconomic statistical analysis of the impact of the energy sector in the economy of Trinidad and Tobago in an attempt to formulate guidelines for policymakers with the objective of achieving sustained economic growth and improved economic well-being for both current and future generations in Trinidad and Tobago. We are eager to hear from you, Dr. Baahu.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, and good evening to all webinar viewers. My focus in this evening's discussion is the economics of the upstream hydrocarbon sector in our country, Trinidad and Tobago. Just to present a slide on the experience of our country in terms of production over the last 4 decades or so, to set the tone for some of the recommendations that I would make at the end. What we have been experiencing in our country is 4 decades of declining oil production. The decades that I'm referring to is the 80s, the 90s, the first decade of the 21st century, and the second decade that we just ended. So that's 4 decades of declining oil production. We also had a recent decade, an ongoing period, in fact, of declining natural gas or lower natural gas production, which some of my fellow speakers alluded to just before, where the natural gas production is currently less than what is required by the natural gas users of the country. So we are in a challenging situation in terms of our current production level. And this situation is likely to continue, provided that no solutions are implemented. So if nothing is done, we would continue to see decline in production of oil, decline in production of gas. If solutions are not administered, and that's not optimal in any way. We would like to see corrections to be implemented. Now, one of the solutions, or rather one of the causes, in my view, of that declining oil and gas production is petroleum taxes that exist in our country. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons. And I want to elaborate a little bit about that. The majority of the oil and gas currently being produced in our country is governed by an exploration and production license system. There's another system working simultaneously with the E&P license system called the production sharing contract. But it turns out the majority of the oil and gas that is produced in Trinidad is governed by the first system, the E&P license system. Under that system, petroleum taxes are applicable. And these petroleum taxes were in fact introduced in the year 1974, many decades earlier. And the environment that existed then and the environment that exists now, two totally different environments. In the 1970s, the focus at the time was oil. Gas had very little importance or a very small role in the economy at that point in time. And the oil production was growing rapidly in the 70s. Simultaneously with that growth in production, the price of oil was also increasing in that period. So with rapid growth in production and price, the hydrocarbon industry in Trinidad and Tobago was experiencing a situation which was referred to as windfall profits, excessive profits, profits beyond what's considered to be sufficient for investments. And with that remarkable level of profit, the government at the time, recognizing that the oil and the little gas that was produced at the time really belonged to the country and should have been benefiting the country as a whole more, the government at the time implemented taxes given that environment. Now, the taxes that were implemented then, they still exist right now. And I have on the screen the rates. Now, the taxes were adjusted in certain years leading up between then and now, but they were not changed in any significant way. And just by looking at some of the rates that you have on the screen, there's a long list, firstly. There's royalty, 12.5%. There's SPT, which becomes applicable if the price of oil is above 50. It does not apply to natural gas, by the way, but given that it applies to oil, it affects that component of the hydrocarbon business. It goes to as high as 55% of gross income. So imagine you're in business and 55% of your income, of your gross income, has to be paid in taxes. Now, it could have been afforded back in the days when production and price were high, and it probably still could be afforded now. But after you pay that high SPT tax, you have other taxes to pay, and look at the list. There's petroleum production levy. Now, I only have the abbreviations here, but I'm stating what they are. Petroleum production levy, it's 4%. It's not a high tax, but bearing in mind that you already paid royalty and SPT, which are significant percentages, there's also green fund levy, a small value. And going down to the last two, you see a very high value appearing again, PPT, petroleum profit tax, 50%. When you have to pay these enormous taxes, it leaves very little for the private investor. It leaves a very small margin for profits to be earned. And just for the sake of comparison, in the non-petroleum upstream sector of the economy, in other words, for all other businesses in Trinidad and Tobago that do not belong to upstream, the taxes that apply are nowhere close to these values that you're seeing on your screen. The taxes that apply to the regular domestic economy, non-petroleum, is 30% at this point in time. There's no SBT, there's no royalty that applies to regular businesses. The equivalent tax on the screen that applies to petroleum businesses, which is equivalent to the 30% tax in terms of the name. Corporation tax is 30% for regular businesses. You see on the screen here, PPT, petroleum profit tax, that's the equivalent tax. It's 50%, it's way higher. And that tax is paid after you pay all those preceding taxes that are listed on the screen. So very little is left for the private investors. Now, I'm saying back in the 1970s, the environment was different with the high volumes of oil and gas. Well, oil was the focus back then, high volumes of oil being produced and the high prices that existed then, or the growing prices that existed then. These things were affordable. But at present, the environment that Trinidad and Tobago's hydrocarbon sector finds itself is most of the producing fields are mature. They are in excess of 25 years, or they have been in production for in excess of 25 years. And we all know when you have a field that has been in production for such a long period of time, the production volume at present would be significantly smaller than what the initial production values would have been decades previously. Such fields require investment to boost production from these depleted areas. EOR is one type of investment, new equipment, workovers. There are a whole set of things that could be done to boost production from mature fields. Now, these things cost money. You have to spend money to boost production from these mature fields. How could you afford to spend money on mature fields when you have to pay those high taxes listed above, which could have been afforded when the field was in its initial years of production, but now in the mature years, it just cannot be afforded. So in addition to the maturity of the fields and the lower production volumes, we also find ourselves in a situation at present where the prices of oil and gas are relatively lower than what was experienced some years earlier. In particular, over the years 2007 to 2014, I recall almost every year of that period, the price of oil was over $100 US per barrel. Now $50 US per barrel is a high price. If we see $50 at present, that's high in this environment. $100 US per barrel between 2007 and 2014 was the norm. $100 or more was the norm. A similar situation applies to natural gas. So I am saying the hydrocarbon industry in Trinidad and Tobago is no longer a windfall profit industry. It's no longer an industry that is earning excessive profits, and it therefore does not deserve to be taxed in the way it's currently being taxed. Taxes therefore need to be adjusted given this change in the environment that the industry finds itself in. Now, why am I making that point? Well, a lot of people, now this is a point I make all the time. And a lot of people say to me when I argue for reducing taxes for the hydrocarbon sector, they say, well, that's not going to be in the interest of the country because you're reducing the amount of revenue the government is expected to earn from the industry and the resources belong to the country, so we should not consider that in any way. But think about it from another angle. If reducing taxes promote investment, or first enable investors to earn a sufficient return on their investment, which stimulates expenditure and investment strategies on these mature fields, what will happen? Production will be boosted. Production, which has been declining for decades, will be boosted. We're going to turn around the trend that we have been experiencing for so long. And if it turns out that there's a cut in taxes, a cut in the tax rate, but the production is boosted more than proportionately, the end result of that is going to be more revenue for government. Just to give some basic numbers, if you cut taxes by, let's say, 25%, and the effect of that is production is boosted by 100%, it doubles. Even though you're collecting less revenue per barrel in taxes, the fact that you have such a larger number of barrels, it means you are likely to have more revenue being created for the government. Is that good? Definitely it is. We in an environment right now where the government says almost every day they lack sufficient funds to cover their developmental programs and government projects across the country. They lack funds for diversification of the economy. They lack funds for keeping the public service in proper operations. So lowering the taxes applicable, especially to the mature fields, will promote investment in such fields. It will boost production. it will possibly lead to more tax revenue for the same for government, and it will also create more jobs. It will enable a future for the industry, because if nothing is done, that decline in production that I emphasized in my first slide, it will continue. And sooner or later, you would have a country with reserves below the surface, but it's not being produced because no private company could make money from attempting to produce from it because of the high taxes. So just to end with my central point, if there is to be a future for the hydrocarbon sector in Trinidad and Tobago, a revision to petroleum taxes need to be done. Now, I must recognize there are some incentives to mature fields and other tax credits and so on. But the fact that production is declining means that these existing incentives and tax credits are not sufficient to turn around the declining trend in the oil and gas production that the country is facing. And I make this point one more time, the environment that existed when those taxes were set is totally null and void at this point in time. And that's one of the reasons for me stating personally that those taxes need to be revised in order to ensure a future for the hydrocarbon industry in Trinidad and Tobago. And with that, I end my contribution to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Baahu, for bringing the economics aspect to the forefront. So we'll be moving on to Mr. Brian Cabrera. Brian Cabrera is currently a second-year student in the Bachelor's of Applied Science in the Energy Systems Engineering program at the University of Trinidad and Tobago. He currently holds a National Engineering Technician's Diploma in Petroleum Engineering and serves as the Vice President of the UTT, Society of Petroleum Engineers Student Chapter. Prior to attending the University of Trinidad and Tobago, Brian attended Presentation College, San Fernando, where he was frequently involved in sports and assumed several leadership roles. The table is all yours, Brian.
Good night, everyone. Thanks for having us. And I would like to say again, thank you for the very esteemed panelists on this discussion tonight. I'll be providing the students' perspective on the current hydrocarbon transition that's happening right now in Trinidad. Right. So first to start off, the green target timeline. Back in August 2015, the government of Trinidad and Tobago had for the first time set a specific target for renewable energy, that being 10% of power generation from renewables itself by 2021. And earlier on, so later on now, back in 2019 or October, Trinidad and Tobago committed to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 15% by the year 2030. So some recent developments now in order to achieve that target, the CRM project, or Carbon Dioxide Emissions Reduction and Mobilization Project. This was undertaken by the University of Trinidad and Tobago and the University of Texas, Austin, and also UE, in order to create a clean new industry that would store greenhouse gas underground and emit and mitigate Trinidad and Tobago's contribution to the human-induced climate change. Another project, within the same project now we have Lightsource, BP, Shell, and BP, which have embarked on the construction of a 92.2 megawatt solar farm in the Couva area. So this is the same CRM project. So the current capacity of Trinidad and Tobago right now in terms of energy is 1,400 megawatts. And as you can see here, 92 megawatts, this solar farm accounts for 92 megawatts. There are also some other projects being undertaken, such as at Piaco International Airport, producing 1.4 megawatts, also in Trin City as well, 20 megawatts, and the Beetham landfill, a waste-to-energy facility, which would produce 10 megawatts. So in total, that would bring us to, roughly 10% of our energy capacity being from renewable sources. So these are things that are currently happening, and we are also looking at carbon capture and storage and the use of carbon dioxide for enhance oil recovery as well. So the move is decarbonization, so reducing the carbon footprint on the globe. So this will be done via carbon capture, as mentioned before, solar, geothermal sources, so renewable energy. And we would also need to reconfigure the educational requirements in the talent pool, meaning what the students would be exposed to, what would be required by students, in order to move forward with this current energy transition. So there will be a new niche for energy systems engineering, which would bridge the gap between, let's say, a student that was studying petroleum engineering and a student that was studying versus a student who was studying mechanical engineering. You can enter the energy systems dynamic, and that would bridge the gap between the educational requirements back in, let's say, 10 years ago versus now because of this transition. So what can companies do to encourage students to engage in the transition? So we have 3 points here. We want to increase student engagement via decarbonization showcase events. So, just little initiatives to get students thinking about the decarbonization topic. Also, adopt a school. So a company could adopt a school, have frequent engagement with educational institutions to inspire students to move towards this transition, to inspire more students to look at the energy discussion as something more important than they actually view it right now. Because from engaging students, people, they don't really know what is happening right now in terms of the transition, in terms of energy in Trinidad and Tobago. And also invest more in public advertising around the decarbonization topic via social media platforms. We all know students use social media, probably 95% of students use social media. And that would be the best way to reach students in order to get their minds in the direction of this energy transition. So again, I will be representing SPE on this, my slide. So what SPE is currently trying to do right now, which is Society of Petroleum Engineers, we want to take the talent pool in the direction most suited for the future. So we must focus on capacity building in the following areas: carbon capture, artificial intelligence, machine learning. Because of where the world is right now, we are going towards energy efficiency. And the most efficient way, to say it like that, to move towards energy efficiency is by letting computers do it for us and integrating that technology into what we are doing. And UTT is currently doing that right now. With our the energy systems program in UTT, they have integrated a lot of data science, the BSc program, data science, artificial intelligence, all of that has been integrated to the discussion. And renewable energy forms being the last point, such as solar, geothermal, wind, hydroelectric. So thank you for having me on this discussion. Any questions or queries?
Thank you, Brian, for bringing the whole perspective on the energy transition, and as a youth representing SPE as well. So moving on to our last and final panelist for tonight's session, we have Mr. Conrad Len. So Mr. Conrad Len was appointed chairman of NGC in July 2019. He holds an MBA from Brunel University and Henley Management College, and a mini MBA in oil and gas from the CWC School for Energy Limited, all based in London. He is also a certified International Credit Union Development Educator. Mr. Enel has also completed executive training with the Adam Smith Institute in Effective Public Awareness and Communication to promote economic reform, improving the public expenditure cycle from budget preparation to monitoring and evaluation and application of best practices in debt management. He is a past governor of both the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and served as chairman of the G24 subgroup of the IMF. Mr. Enel moved from leadership positions in private sector insurance and technology firms to serve in government from 2001 to 2010. During his career in the business sector, He amassed expertise in both private sector business and international credit union operations. As a chief executive, his responsibility included managing financial plans, forecasts, budgets, and oversight of large budgets. He has also developed capabilities in branding and communications awareness, which includes the ability to drive innovation, innovative marketing, and communications strategies to build awareness. He is no stranger to managing and working in complex organizations with multiple stakeholder groups. He is also a lecturer and practicum supervisor for the MBA Sustainable Energy Management Program and was technical advisor to the Renewable Energy Incubator Project at the Arthur Lockjack Global School of Business. He also lectures in the MBA program on financing for energy projects as well as introduction to oil and gas economics. In my personal opinion, I believe we've saved the best for last. So, Mr. NL, we are eager to hear from you.
So thank you very much and good night, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, thank you for the opportunity. And second, the work that you have done and the material that you have shared with us, I think is very relevant to our discussion. The question that you asked me to consider is there a future for the hydrocarbon sector in Trinidad and Tobago? And the first question that I would pose, which I will also answer, is why is hydrocarbon important? The reason that hydrocarbon is important is because hydrocarbon is used to improve the quality of life of ordinary people. And as long as ordinary people aspire for a better quality of life, the way that they do that is through the use of hydrocarbons. That's the first issue. The second issue is that more and more people globally are getting to the stage where they can afford to aspire and to pay for better quality of life. And if we look at China and we look at India, we see demand for hydrocarbon exceeding supply because more and more people are in fact requesting that commodity. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have the energy sector, where the energy sector began in a very peculiar way. The energy sector in Trinidad and Tobago was driven by a particular objective where Trinidad and Tobago chose not to simply be a producer of oil and gas and get money for it, but instead to create an industry and to use that industry as part of the industrialization process of Trinidad and Tobago. What that meant, therefore, is that over the long term, and we've been in this business for about 100 years now, over the long term, Trinidad and Tobago will have a place in the energy sector globally because it will have infrastructure that will allow it to continue to produce for the rest of the world. The reason that this is such a complex issue is because the oil sector or the hydrocarbon sector basically is comprised of a number of components. First of all, you have oil. And somebody spoke to oil and the decline of production insofar as the history was concerned. But added to that is the very definite policy position of the government to move from oil to gas, gas being a more environmentally friendly fossil. And of course, the natural projection or the natural progression for that is to move from natural gas to renewables. There are issues around that, and there are challenges around that. But for the time being, the Trinidad and Tobago economy is primarily a gas-based economy, because that is where the investment dollars flow. And more importantly, that is where the multinational corporations are investing. And therefore, Trinidad and Tobago has found itself in sync with what is taking place in the international community. Just to make the point on the natural gas production that we have in Trinidad and Tobago. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have 3 streams of income from the natural gas resource. We have LNG, we have ammonia, and we have methanol. One of the challenges that Trinidad and Tobago faces at this point in time is that all of these products, ammonia, methanol, and LNG, because of decisions made in the United States, have created for us a price issue. Insofar as ammonia and methanol are concerned, as we speak now, year on year, the commodity prices in the market have reduced by about 40%. In those circumstances, therefore, what is happening with current production is that companies cannot make it work economically because of supply issues in the marketplace. And while that was taking place, we had COVID-19 that created for us an additional constraint. But I want to make the point that methanol as a product from natural gas is used in a number of industries. And unless those industries go out of business, we will continue to be in a good place. So for example, methanol is used in construction, it is used in automotive, it is used in electronics, appliances, paints and coatings, insulation, pharmaceuticals, and solvents. And this is just on the methanol side. So that we as a country are in a good place because our product, our primary product, is required to go into the development, if you will, the manufacture, if you will, of all of these particular prices. There are a couple of things that I wanted to talk to at this point in time, and we can always come back to it, and it is this. The hallmark of the Trinidad and Tobago hydrocarbon sector has really been its fiscal incentive program. And I heard one of our speakers talk about the taxation situation. I have a slightly different view. The reason that the upstream sector is taxed at 50% is because there are other benefits that they get upfront in the exploration side of the business. And the country shares in the risk profile for exploration. So when it shares in the risk profile for exploration, and those costs are dealt with upfront, on the profit side, you also share in the profit. So you sort of balance the exploration risk and the profit margins. And that is peculiar for the exploration side of the business only. And that's why the tax system is set up that way. Usually, the way that the country looks at its tax competitiveness is that it ranks its tax in two continuums. The first one is that you try to make sure that the companies that are doing business with you, and they're international companies that are doing business with you, can do business with you on the basis of a taxation system that is competitive. So if they're staying in the country, and if in fact they're doing business and they're getting involved in more and more activity, it is because the taxation or the fiscals are working for them. And in many instances, even at these tax rates, in one particular year, a company paid the government some $32 billion in taxes. What that basically meant is that they were moving $32 billion of profits out of this jurisdiction into another jurisdiction simply on the basis of the 50%. So, you have to look at the numbers to deal with that. So the two areas are, you make sure that you're internationally competitive, and you make sure that you get the best value for the people of Trinidad and Tobago because you are managing the resource on their behalf. Trinidad and Tobago exists in the value chain of energy. So Trinidad and Tobago, if you look at how we are positioned, we are in exploration, we are in the midstream sector, and we are also in the downstream sector. It means that we can get value and we can in fact compete in any segment of the market. That is not the case with some other jurisdictions. There are other jurisdictions, for example, that only operate as a producer of revenue. If you look at Guyana, for example, Guyana's position has been that they are looking for the revenue and they will redistribute the revenue into education, into agriculture and those kind of things. But insofar as setting up an industry and making sure that the industry is there over the long term. So you have plant on the ground, you have, in Trinidad and Tobago today, if we're doing absolutely nothing, the energy companies are going to spend $2 billion US simply in maintaining plant. And that goes into the entire sector, and that operates within the context. Let me deal, though, with the issue of what are we doing in Trinidad and Tobago, because we've done a lot of history. We've talked a lot about global statistics, and we are talking a lot about matters that are important. Well, let me deal with the particular issue. As a country, what are we doing? Well, like everything else, when we look at the energy landscape, we are seeing what we refer to as a new normal. The dynamics have changed. It used to be that Trinidad and Tobago had an advantage in that we had what was reasonably called or referred to as low-cost gas. And we developed a lot of industries with that, electricity and a number of things. That is no longer the case. We now find ourselves in a situation where we have the reserves, but it is costing us a little bit more to bring them into production. So what are some of the companies doing? Well, if you look at the major gas companies, for example, that are looking after government's interests, there are a couple of things that they are doing. The first thing that they're doing is that they're looking at sustainability. That is to say, how do we sustain the sector going forward? And insofar as that is concerned, there are a number of very specific things that they're doing. The first thing that they're doing, of course, is they are developing mechanisms to secure the current business. So it is in the interest of the company to make sure that the current business that we have is secure. And there are a number of ways that the companies are looking at that. The other piece, of course, is developing organizational capability. The skill sets that you have now are not the skill sets that you require for the world that is emerging and the markets that you're looking at. And therefore, the organizations are focusing on developing the organization to respond to that. The third piece, of course, is that you've got to grow the business locally and internationally. And in order to do that, you really have to revisit your value chain and see where there's leakage and see how you can plug that leakage and see what you are doing to ensure that you get more value from the molecule. And that is what companies are doing as well. And because companies have an objective of ensuring that they contribute to the economics, the revenue stream of the country, part of the sustainability agenda is strengthening national contribution. And that is looking at sustainability initiatives, that is looking at renewable energy, that is looking at energy efficiency. But in all of this, I think what is more important is that the government has a role to play, because in some instances, for certain things to happen, certain other things must happen. So that, for example, if we have to move to a renewable energy or a green energy regime, then we have to deal with the question of electricity cost. Because right now we have the lowest energy cost in the Western Hemisphere. And what that means is that renewable energy cannot operate economically if that electricity cost remains at its current rate. So there are some things that you have to do. But if you decide to change the energy cost at this point in time, that flows into inflation, and that goes into the poverty statistics, and that creates a reduction in the value of people on fixed income and their ability to survive. So there are a number of trade-offs that you have to look at. You cannot simply be talking about one side of the equation and not understanding that that one side will impact other things, and you're going to have to put things in place for that. So I think I want to stay here for a while and to answer the question this way. Is there a future for the hydrocarbon sector in Trinidad and Tobago? The answer is yes. However, it is not going to be based on what we have done in the past. It has to be based on what is before us. It has to be based on a new set of dynamics. It has to be based on new things that are happening in technology. It has to be based on new things that are happening in artificial intelligence. It also has to be based on our own ability to get into research and development and use the results of research and development to actually determine how we are going to use the gas that we have, which is a wasting asset, to produce for us the best return. It used to be traditionally that we are involved in the production and we look very much at production. What we are finding out today is that the market and the margins in the market and the placement in the market and the entry into the market and the relationships in the market is what determines whether you succeed or not. So that insofar as your organizations are concerned, there has to be a significant amount of market intelligence, market information, because this business is no longer a regional business. It is now a global business, but it is a business that is driven by decisions that are being made using technology and using information. Information is now the key, and information is what will create for us the opportunities that we are looking at. And I want to stay there for the time being, because I feel that I can more directly answer the questions that you have relative to the specific areas. So David, thank you very much for the opportunity. But the answer to the question is yes, there is a future for this industry in Trinidad and Tobago, because there is a future globally for this business. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Enel, for your insightful points and the perspective you brought with respect to the industry. So let's move right into the panel discussions. And I'd like to take this time to introduce the co-moderator, Mr. Neil Allen. Mr. Allen was the former Vice President of BPTT, and he's currently a discipline coordinator in the Energy Systems Engineering Unit at UTT. So, Mr. Allen, let's get the ball rolling with these questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. One thing I wanted to ask is that we saw some projections being given by people, some of the speakers, and I'm wondering whether the COVID-19 situation should change any of those projections. Do you still believe in those projections which you gave earlier on the, first of all, we have seen a bit of a change since COVID. So I'm wondering whether, do you think that your projections are still valid given the COVID situation?
I would say yes. And the reason that I would say yes is because those projections and the energy companies and the companies that look at this business have a 40 to 50 year time horizon. So they don't look at today. And the reasons for that is because the investments that are required and the decisions that are required, they first of all have long time frames. But secondly, this is a business that is characterized by its long-term activity rather than its short-term. So for example, when prices are low or when prices are high, the companies behave in a particular way. So COVID-19 would have created some changes in the short-term activity, but in terms of what is taking place, in terms of the demand, in terms of the supply, in terms of the reserves, in terms of all of that, over the longer term, it will work itself out. So yes, I think that we're still working with those protections.
Anyone else wants to chime in on that one? Dr. Baahu, you had something to add to that?
Well, it is assumed that a vaccine will be developed for COVID-19 after a period of about a year or so, right? So until that vaccine is developed, you would continue to see disruptions in economic activity, but let's assume the vaccine is really developed and administered. Subsequent to that period, we should see a return to what global activities in tandem to what they were like pre-COVID-19. So over the long term, just as Mr. Ennell was saying, it's likely to not be affected on account of that. Now, if no vaccine is developed, it's a different story. Yeah?
What do you all feel about the fact that we have a very old industry and hence we have very high lifting costs? Both so in the area of oil, we have high lifting costs there. And secondly, in the area of gas, we are now developing much smaller pools, and those smaller pools have a higher unit cost of development. So what do you think, how does that position us if you want to remain in that part of the business of producing barrels? How do you think we can venture in that area, given the age of our fields and the age of our resources?
Well, I think that the age of our resources and the question that you posed with aging infrastructure, there are two parts of it. So the first part has to do with the multinationals, and the second part has to do, of course, with the local company, Heritage, the previous Petrotrin. I think in the current construct, what has happened is that the government has sought to isolate, in some instances, those assets that would bring the revenue stream and the production down. So they have put into very specific areas the parts of the company that will provide you with the positive results. So if you look at Heritage results, for example, you're seeing that it is posting profits. If you look at the refinery, you'd find that in real terms, it's not making the kind of losses it has before. And in terms of indigenous crude, instead of using that in the refinery, you're trying to export that and get the best cost. So the answer to your question is, insofar as oil is concerned, the government has reformulated the system or the structure in such a way that it is contributing positively rather than negatively. Insofar as gas is concerned, while you have a lot that is being said about the cost of gas going into the downstream, the bigger issue has to do with the market, and the bigger issue has to do with how the market is responding. At this point in time, we see for the next 2 years, the market is going to be depressed. So I think what you're going to see is companies cutting back, companies looking at retooling, companies looking at becoming more efficient, companies looking at restructuring the operations on the basis of current revenue. So I think that there are going to be some losses. I think that there are going to be some job losses. There are going to be some scaling back. You're seeing Shell and you're seeing BP sending home a significant amount of people. I think that that is going to be the nature of the business going forward. But I think what that will do is that it will continue to make the companies profitable at lower revenue streams. And that profitability is what will contribute towards the revenue stream that the government uses for its own operations. Because those companies do not, as a matter of course, not operate profitably. They have a profit motive and they do what is required in order to achieve that. Just on the COVID-19 issue, my experience has been that what companies are finding out is that as a result of the COVID opportunity, they are able to operate their businesses now with a lot less resources. And many of the companies are actually trying to figure out what they do, what are they going to do with excess resources that they currently have. And in some instances, those resources have to be deployed in new areas of business, because I'm aware that some companies have run and they've run more efficiently with the COVID restrictions, in that people working from home have been able to produce at a higher rate than when they were operating in the work environment. This is what we are seeing. So you know, there's some benefits in that.
Dr. Baahu, you mentioned the issue around taxes, and I'm wondering, for a long time we have been using getting the rent out of the barrels, and I'm wondering whether we're not getting to a point in time where we should change that construct and look at a different way of earning money within the sector. What do you think about that?
Well, the value of the barrel years ago and the value of the barrel now is two different values. And when, you know, let's say the price of a barrel of oil was $100 per barrel, the profit per barrel is likely to be way higher compared to if a barrel is selling for $50 a barrel. So when oil is selling at $100 a barrel, the companies can afford to pay higher taxes. But when the revenue is smaller at a lower price, they cannot afford to pay the taxes that, well, they might be able to afford it, but what is left as a return on investment to the companies is so little that they may not have any incentive to boost production from mature fields. So that is where I am of the view that these mature fields need further incentives in order to allow operators to invest the required sums of money in these fields, which would result in higher production for the company and for the country.
Dr. Budal, I'm wondering whether, with all the CO2 we have around, whether we can't use that from an entrepreneurial standpoint to kind of create jobs, because what we're looking at in the sector is a loss of jobs. I mean, there's been a significant loss of jobs over the last few years in this sector. What do you think is the opportunity there of using CO2, for example, as a source of creating businesses around CO2?
Okay, well, certainly if there's a future for hydrocarbon sector in Trinidad and Tobago, then we have to find a way to deal with the associated CO2 emissions. So your question is quite relevant. There are many ways in which we can do so. And as you rightly alluded to, some of these ways can create jobs. You can use CO2 to form certain petrochemicals, formic acid. CO2 is being used for building materials. CO2 is being used in the food and beverage industry. So there are many uses of CO2 that can in itself grow new industries and therein create jobs which can have a societal benefit to Trinidad and Tobago in that future, that same hydrocarbon future. However, if you were to, and I want to go back to the sustainability, if you were to look at it from a more holistic sustainability viewpoint, you would think you need to look at the volumes. While the job creation aspect and the economical aspect of it, these CO2 usage fruits or opportunities are great. In terms of reducing emissions to that level that is required in that hydrocarbon future for our temperature levels to be stabilized as it should be, then more is needed. More is needed than just thinking about the job creations, as important as they may be. For example, carbon capture and storage in that hydrocarbon future. When that hydrocarbon is combusted, burnt, and you have CO2 emissions emanating into the atmosphere, you can capture it and you can geologically store it for a prolonged period of time. That has the ability to tackle a large amount of emissions, larger than the usage we spoke about, CO2 to building materials and whatnot. And they can also create, that use can also create jobs that can have a ripple positive effect on the economy and the society. So I see great opportunity for CO2 usage and CO2 usage industries in Trinidad and Tobago to marry with this hydrocarbon future. I want to make a couple points very quickly. We must ensure that, I want to make the point that mitigation and, as I made earlier, high mitigation and economic growth are not mutually exclusive. In other words, one of the speakers before alluded to you can go to renewables, and but it could have an impact on the economy. Your pricing structure for electricity would need to be reformed, and that can have another impact on the other side of the coin in terms of society and the poverty line. And that is correct. However, I wanted to make the point that it is important, it is very important that we consider, when we look at that narrative, we must understand that there are actions, technologies, and strategies that could reduce our emissions and contribute positively to the economy. Not all mitigation technology is going to hit the economy in a negative way. There are what I call the low-hanging fruits that can reduce emissions and positively contribute to the economy, not just the ones we just spoke about, but in many ways. Energy efficiency is perhaps one on the forefront, and that serves us well. And I think all speakers this evening agreed to that. I also think, just to reply quickly again, I want to endorse Dr. Baahu's point that you have to respond with a fiscal regime, and you have to respond with your incentives in a manner that is commensurate with what you're responding to. So for example, just at the risk of being too simplistic, a child between the age of 0 to 2 years will eat a certain type of food, and then 2 to 5, a certain type, and greater than 5 years, a different type. Similarly, our industry in Trinidad and Tobago, our hydrocarbon industry, has that natural growth, that age curve as well. And we're no longer in the high growth period, we're in the mature period. And therefore, the same taxation regime, policies, fiscal regime that we had 30 years ago seriously needs to be looked at in the mature stage now. I'm not saying that we need to erode them completely. We need to look at them in a more sustainable manner and see how, instead of just getting, it could have, as Edward said, it could have a positive effect on the same taxation revenues if you decrease and stimulate growth and investment.
Thank you very much, Dr. Budal. Dr. Baahu, showed a graph there where there was from 2010 onwards, the contribution to GDP of the petroleum sector was much smaller. But I saw actually on the graph that the GDP was going up, whereas the contribution was going down. Is that an indication that we're having some bit of diversification going on in the economy?
Yeah, the graph was presented by Dr. Budal. I remember seeing
sorry,
the graph.
Dr. Budal, sorry.
I could talk about it too. It's an interesting question you have there. I don't think it was what you supposed to. It's not diversification. What was actually happening in that period was, even though the energy sector had started to decline in that period, the government sector continued to spend, or they didn't. The response in terms of government spending was marginal. And because the government really drives the non-energy sector, the government drives the rest of the economy continued at a certain level. It did not decline as fast as the petroleum sector. So it would have appeared that the non-energy sector was growing faster, was declining slower than the energy sector, but it's really because of government's slow response to declining revenues. And it was not diversification.
Okay, all right. Okay, thanks for that clarification.
So just to interject, before we close off, we have two questions, and one is from Mr. Eric Williams, and his question is how Trinidad and Tobago might also retool to maintain the revenue stream as represented by its gross national income, not only GDP.
Right, I would take that one. Those are some economic terms there. The question is an excellent one, and to answer it, let me take just a few moments to describe the difference between GDP, which was in one of the charts in the presentation this evening, and gross national income, another measure of a country's level of income. Gross domestic product focuses on the total value generated in a country from producing goods and services. The gross national income is the income that really accrues to the nationals of the country. So what is the difference? Well, you might have production taking place in a country, and as in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, a large percentage of it might be under the control of foreign companies. So the income that is generated from the production within that sector, some of it goes to the home countries to which these foreign companies came. So BP being a company that originates from Britain, some of the income that BP earns in Trinidad goes to the shareholders in Britain and the rest of the world, for that, in fact. So how do we boost gross national income? Well, what if we have more local companies participating in the sector? That would reduce the amount of income generated in the country that leaves our shores and goes to other countries. So I am calling, therefore, for increased local participation. Now, local participation cannot just be done if we say local participation. It has to be done provided that the local participant has the capacity to perform, has the capacity to be engaged in the way in which these foreign companies are currently engaged. Another way in which the gross national income could be grown is if we have local companies, not necessarily in petroleum alone, but local companies that go abroad and perform economically. So I said not necessarily in petroleum, so it could be petroleum service companies, it could be petroleum producing companies, it could even be the conglomerates that exist in Trinidad, which we know operate outside of Trinidad. And when they operate outside of Trinidad, they earn income abroad, and that income accrues to the shareholders who are local Trinidad and Tobago shareholders. So gross national income captures income that could be earned in foreign countries and brought home to Trinidad. And it also deducts income earned in Trinidad that goes abroad. So how do we boost the local value? By earning more locally and keeping it in the hands of nationals, as well as earning money abroad and bringing it home to Trinidad. So if we could promote the export of our services, of our petroleum services, of all the experience that the country has gathered over the last 100 years being involved in the petroleum sector. That is definitely one way in achieving that. And the other thing that I mentioned is if we could increase the amount of local involvement in the sector that is currently dominated by foreign participants.
We have another second question there, Angeline, please.
So in closing, we would like to take Mr. NL's feedback to the question that Mr. Williams asked. Mr. NL?
No, I think it is. Eric asked this question 10 years ago, and I don't think it has changed. Because I think that he wants to make sure that we capture the value differently. So I agree with the comments made by the last two speakers. I just want to make one point, and is this. I think that it is important that we don't reinvent what has not worked in the past. A lot of the solutions that we are talking about did not work in the past, and there are reasons for it. The energy sector is a highly risky business, and the companies that you see have a tolerance for taking high risk and taking high losses. And the matrix in the business does not support local investment because the investments that we have locally don't have the reach and they don't have what is currently available. So there has to be some kind of consortium, if you will, of interest to mitigate the risks that are involved inside it, because this is a risky business. And when you lose rather large. Some of the companies that we have seen here have lost large, but because of the long-term horizon and because of their global capital capacity, they're able to mitigate risk and spread them around the world. So that's another feature of the industry.
Okay. So in closing, I'd like to take this time to thank all the panelists. Thank you to my co-moderator, Mr. Allen, to the audience, and to the University of Trinidad and Tobago for allowing us to host this webinar. So with that being said, everyone, please have a good night. Take care.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, ciao.